Well, thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here. I am substituting for Andrew Spear, who was already mentioned as a very inspirational speaker. And when you are a less important person trying to replace a highly inspirational, more important person, your job should be not really to try. And so my comparative advantage as an academic and as an unimportant person is that I don't have to be as diplomatic. So I can try to lay out what we think we really know and don't know, what's important, what's not important. We'll confirm some of the things that most of you probably believe and step on a few toes as well. And we're doing that in the context today, the World Resources Institute with the World Bank, UNEP, UNDP, and CIRAD and INRA is releasing this report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future. We hope you'll read it. We have flyers here that show you to the website and a whole bag full of reports online here that I can hand out copies to. So please come up and get them afterwards. And the essence of it is to try to say what really matters. What really matters. So the first thing the first point I want to get across is that actually the problem is even bigger than most of us think it is. So we start off with the fact that we have almost a billion people, and the limiting factor of that, a billion people hungry, is that when food is short, the hungry are the people who experience the hardship. So we cannot afford to have periods when food is short. Yet agriculture already occupies half of the world's vegetated lands, and it produces about 25% of all the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And this despite the fact that agriculture has been phenomenally successful. If you think about it, when I was a kid, the argument was made that we would have billions of hungry people on the planet today. Agricultural productivity gains have supplied more than 80% of all the food production rather than land expansion. Agriculture has been phenomenally successful, and yet we have these enormous challenges. So the challenge gets worse. So first off, right now we are facing a food gap of roughly 70% of the food that was produced in 2006. Now that number should sound familiar to you because the FAO put out that number a couple years ago, but our number is even worse because the FAO number was actually measured in terms of dollars. And when you translate that into dollars, it was more in the 54% of a food gap. But we now, since the FAO came out with those numbers, the main change has been that we're now expecting another 500 million people on the planet in 2050. And when you extrapolate and recalculate the numbers, we're talking about something on the order of a likely 70% food gap. Now, to give you some idea, if we wanted to produce all of that food, all of the crops that we need, without expanding agricultural land, just through yield gains alone, we would have to increase yields roughly at 30% higher rate than we did from 1962 to 2006. Now, 1962 to 2006 was the Green Revolution. It was the period when we doubled irrigation, when we brought synthetic fertilizer to most of the world, and if all we do is match that rate of yield growth, we will have enormous land use change. We will have failed. So if that's the only thing we do to try to close that yield gap, we will have failed. Now, one reason this has been not understood is that yield growth is basically linear, not exponential. And if people assume exponential growth, they end up with much higher projections. But yield growth, generally speaking, is linear. And the other thing is that we're going to need to boost yields for a lot more than cereals. We don't actually have to maintain the same rate of yield growth for cereals that we had. But when you look at all the other crops that we need to boost the yield growth, actually, from these blue bars compared to the yellow bars, you need to increase it. And we're not keeping up. So a lot of people don't realize, but we have seen an explosion of harvested area in the world in the last 10 years. For the 20 previous years, for the 15 major crops, there was no expansion in harvested area. There was some expansion for other crops. In the last 10 years, we've had almost 100 million hectare expansion. The reason people aren't focusing on that is because the statistics on cropland area have not expanded as much. And some people think that because we're just double cropping or plowing up fallow land more. That's probably not the case. The statistics on cropland just basically aren't very good. We go into that in the report. So we are seeing right now a situation where we are not actually keeping up. This is not just speculative. We are seeing a large increase in expansion of harvested area, and that is manifesting itself in many countries in expansion of cropland. The other thing is pasture really matters. Somehow or other, people don't talk about pasture. Pasture has been roughly half of all land use change. And we're expected to go up. It looks like it's declined recently, but that's all due to the fact that in Australia, basically, they recategorized a bunch of dry land. So it's no longer pasture. And it's continuing to expand outside. Now, one of the problems that hasn't really been focused on is if you look at the FAO projections and many other modeling projections, they are assuming that we get an 80% increase in the output of milk and meat from pasture, not just cropland. If we don't, we get hundreds of millions of hectares of land use change. So we actually, from the standpoint of climate mitigation and protecting forests and wetlands and savannas, increasing pasture yields is every bit as important as increasing crop yields or dealing with that challenge. Let me see if I can go on. Okay. Now the other thing is, if you then project where greenhouse gas emissions are likely to be from agriculture in 2050, right now they're at 12 if you count associated land use change. It's a fairly reasonable prediction to imagine they'll be at 15 by 2050. So 12 is only 25% of greenhouse gas emissions today. This is the total level that most scientists think the world can emit from all human sources by 2050 to have only 2-degree climate change. Agriculture is on a path to emit 15, which would be 70% of all allowable emissions levels, just from agriculture. So if agriculture were to do its fair share, it would have to go down to 4 gigatons, which would mean we have to produce 70% more food and cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3. Okay, so I hope I'm getting you a little worried here. But there is hope. But before I give you hope, let me give you one more challenge. And this is important for Africa. This is a global issue, but the center is Africa. The sub-Saharan African population is expected to increase from about 900 million to 2.1 billion in 2050, and 3.9 billion by 2100. Now that means that for sub-Saharan Africa to feed itself in 2050, while still importing about 15% of its staple calories, food production in sub-Saharan Africa would have to go up 360%. Some people think sub-Saharan Africa should be an exporter of staple crops to the world, not just cash crops, which is a huge exporter of cash crops, but staple crops. In order to be a net exporter of staple crops, you have to, at first, stop importing. If sub-Saharan Africa wanted to feed itself without imports by 2050, without exports, the increase would have to be 440%. So the FAO projects very large yield increases, and that would still lead to 125 million hectares of land use change in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a good part of where it's going to happen. It means production has to increase dramatically, and we have to see what we can do to also hold down the increase in demand, which I'll come back to. Okay, but that is not even considering the challenges of climate change. So I won't go into it, but the general science is that climate change is now likely to be more negative than we used to think, mainly because of increasing understanding of the sensitivity of crops to peak high temperatures. And the other thing is, none of the numbers I've given you assume any expansion. Oh, well, here's another issue. So in sub-Saharan Africa, it is not merely climate change, global climate change, that is a threat, but deforestation itself and its effect on regional temperatures. So this is a study that didn't have enough attention paid to it, that looked at what is the impact on the climate in sub-Saharan Africa if we have 30% deforestation, which is essentially the FAO projection. And while it's a complicated study, and I can't go into it completely, the basic story is that with 30% deforestation, the effect of mild climate change in the region becomes as bad as the effect of large climate change. That's because what forests do is they cool the climate, they maintain precipitation. So it is a strong interest in Africa to preserve its forests for food production in Africa. Now, none of the changes I've talked about assume any expansion of biofuel production. So to produce 10% of the world's transportation fuel from biofuels in 2050 using crops, which would produce about 2% of the world's energy, would take 32% of world crop production today by calorie. So if we have 10% of the world's transportation fuels from biofuels in 2050, that 70% gap becomes a 100% gap. Okay, so let's go to solutions. So the most obvious solution is to produce more food on the same land. What is climate-smart agriculture? It's good agriculture. Now, how do we do that? Well, if you look at all the estimates of yield gaps, you look at all the potential for technology, could we do it? Yes, we could. We go through in the paper the enormous opportunities available to crop breeding, not because of genetic engineering, although that has too, but just because we can now identify the role of individual genes in that improving breeding. And there is no opportunity to leave farmers behind. What Linda Wei was talking about, the farmers of Africa, we cannot do it unless we provide them with the means of producing up to their potential. So everyone knows this, it's just true. If we don't produce 70% more food on the same land, we will have large-scale land use change. And what does that mean? One of the interesting things is you come to these global forums and there's a debate, should we focus on adaptation, should we focus on mitigation? Adaptation is mitigation. The first goal of climate-smart agriculture is to produce the food we need on existing agricultural land. If you can't do that because of climate change, you're going to have more land use change, and that means more carbon emissions. So adaptation is mitigation more than 90% of the time. And we have seen, this is a complicated graphic, but the key point here is the yellow. As we've gone from the decades, from the 1960s into the 2000s, more and more agricultural production has come just from using inputs more efficiently. So that's encouraging, but that basically has to become, this whole bar has essentially to become close to yellow. Now, there are exceptions. Now, the exception of where adaptation equals mitigation is wetlands. Because one of the good techniques for adapting to changing rainfall is to move into wetlands. But wetlands have a lot of carbon. And there's a great temptation to move into wetlands all around the world, including in Africa, for many sound reasons. Now, the place where this is the biggest problem is in Southeast Asia, where essentially a few million hectares of deep peatlands cleared for oil palm production are now responsible for about 2.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions from all human sources. And by the next 15 years, that could grow to a level equal to 7.5%. Now, what that means is that less than 1% of the world's cropland could be producing not 7.5% of agricultural emissions, but 7.5% of all human emissions. And this is due to the demand for palm oil. But what's the solution? We have solutions. The solution is we probably have enough degraded land in Southeast Asia, a lot of it overrun by imperator grasslands, to produce the palm oil we need. And it's productive. There are huge institutional challenges. But when you look at the global scheme, this is one of the solutions. We could do this. If we don't do it, we lose. More peatland conversion is not something we can take. I mentioned pasture productivity. We have enormous potential to improve pasture productivity, generally speaking, in the wetter tropics. Brazil's potential to improve this is well known. I doubt we can do 80%, but we can do a lot. Now, the extreme version of pasture productivity is intensive silvopastoral systems. So in Colombia, they've got about 10,000 hectares of intensive silvopastoral systems, where they have 3 different layers. They have a shrub layer, a tree layer, and a grass layer, and they get 5 to 10 times the productivity of typical grazing land. So we have enormous technical opportunity to do that, but we're going from maybe a few tens of thousands of hectares in the world, and we need to scale that up to tens of millions of hectares in the world quickly. And the challenge is, it's a completely different business. To raise cattle this way is to be a highly managed farming operation. It needs a lot more labor, a lot more skill, a lot more capital, but enormous labor productivity gains, enormous opportunities for more workforce. So this is technically doable. The question is, can we do it? Will we do it? And one reason to do it, as I said, is that grasses actually provide half of all the world's animal feed, so we have to take that seriously. Now, one of the challenges is this. Even though we need to increase productivity, just increasing yields is not enough. So a few years ago, a couple of economists at CIFOR noticed this and noticed that actually in many countries in the world where you increase crop yields, you actually get expansion of cropland area. And there's a very simple reason why. You become more competitive to supply crops to the world. And you get a shift in where cropland occurs. And to some extent, that's good. But in general, when we shift to agricultural land, that means plowing up tropical forests. And that the costs in carbon and biodiversity are greater than the gains. So here is the single central challenge of climate-smart agriculture. We want to produce a lot more food on the same land all around the world, particularly in the developing world where it is most needed, and yet we want to do so without leading to further local expansion of cropland. And the deal should be that the whole world has a stake in increasing that productivity, and in return, everyone agrees to protect natural savannas and forests and wetlands, in part because of the own crop benefits. As I said, if Africa were to lose 30% of its forest area, that would have negative implications for its production. Oh, sorry. Didn't want to do that. And let me talk about the other things that really matter. So if we shift from land use, roughly speaking, half of all agricultural production greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock, from ruminant livestock. And if you look at Africa, basically all of Africa's agricultural emissions, for all intents and purposes, come from land use change and ruminant livestock. And, oh shoot, I keep doing this. And the good news is there's a very simple way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ruminant livestock. It's to raise them more efficiently, to feed them better, to give them better health care. So various studies have shown that very feasible ways of increasing the feeding efficiency of ruminant livestock in Africa, for example, could reduce greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk by 2/3. So one of our opportunities is just to produce livestock more efficiently. That is our single great opportunity right now. And this is a shift in thinking about what climate-smart agriculture is. This chart, many of you may recognize, was the IPCC's 2007 report on what the mitigation opportunities were from agriculture. And without going in detail, all of the red was various forms of carbon sequestration. 90% was supposed to be some form of carbon sequestration. And now the same scientists who produced this generally agree that was a great overestimate. Above all, climate-smart agriculture, from the standpoint of reducing emissions, is simply being more productive with inputs. That's your single greatest opportunity. Getting carbon back into the soils turns out to be a lot harder than people thought. And one reason it's harder than people thought is that the carbon has to come from somewhere. And we were often counting on strategies that involved essentially taking carbon that was already used, like crop residues or manure or even standing trees, and putting them into the soils, but that sacrifices their use elsewhere. Now, that doesn't mean there are no opportunities. And one of the big opportunities is agroforestry. And the difference between agroforestry and many other carbon sequestration strategies is agroforestry means you're absorbing more carbon. You're producing more carbon. So when you produce more carbon, you have more carbon to store, as well as in soils. And the real benefit of agroforestry that we've started to see is great increases in crop yields, particularly in drier parts of Africa. And our report goes into that. There's enormous potential, we think, in this entire band of Africa to improve agroforestry use. So that's an exception to the overemphasis on carbon sequestration. And then the other side of things is to deal with the demand side by reducing overconsumption. So we've heard a lot about reducing food loss and waste. Our estimate is that losses and waste are about 25% of all the calories produced. And the basic story is if we could cut that in half, we could close that food gap by 20%. Now, doing that is not going to be easy. In the US, all that losses and waste comes at the post-consumer stage. In Africa, where it almost all comes at the production stage and at the harvesting stage. So we know we can harvest more efficiently. The challenge is going to be to making sure that as countries get richer, they don't waste food as much as we do in the United States at the post-consumer stage. But there are successful strategies that are going on, and if we can reduce food losses and waste by half, we get a fifth of the way there. Now, another possibility is to hold down the amount of meat that we consume in these very wealthy countries where we consume a tremendous amount of meat and are likely to consume even more. However, FAO is still projecting that in 2050, about 4 billion people in the world consume very little milk and meat. So we probably mainly need to consume less milk and meat in rich countries to provide more room for poor people to consume more milk and meat. But here's another option, which we think has been underestimated. When you look at the efficiency of production of different milks and meats, beef turns out to be remarkably inefficient. It converts only about 1% of the calories in to edible calories out. Chicken are more than 10% in that regard. Dairy is, what do we have here? It's about 5%. And so you can do a lot better, not by eliminating beef production. Right now we're projected to need 80% more beef by 2050. But if we could hold that growth in beef consumption to 40%, even if we shift that all just to these other meats, that would save hundreds of millions of hectares of land. So part of the story is we need to produce beef and other livestock products as efficiently as we can, but we also have to hold down the amount of the growth in those. And I'll just skip to one last issue, which is population, which people don't often like to talk about. So if you could look forward, we're going to have roughly 2.5 billion more people on the planet by 2050. That's the most likely projection. About half of them are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa under our present course. Now, in most of the rest of the world, the rest are mostly going to be in Asia. And that's mostly due to the fact that in the past decades, Asians had a lot of children. And they've stopped having a lot of children. And short of killing the children, there's nothing you could do to keep that population from growing. In sub-Saharan Africa, however, people are still having a lot of children, more than five children per mother. And there's a very simple reason for this. If you look at the countries, even the poorest countries in the world have reduced their fertility rates close to replacement levels by doing three things: educating girls, keeping children alive, and providing access to family planning. And if you look at where that's not happening, this is the rate of girls' education in lower secondary school in Africa, and it's the lowest in the world. And this is mortality rates of children under 5, and they're the highest in the world. So one of the simple, most important things we can do in sub-Saharan Africa is educate girls and keep children alive, which of course is something we should be doing anyway. Now when you put all of this together, there's a lot of stuff we can do. And one of the things is, and if sub-Saharan Africa were to just achieve replacement level fertility by 2050, and many countries have managed to essentially do what we're asking sub-Saharan Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa might choose to do on its own in 40 years, in 20 or 30 years, so it's a very achievable target, that would reduce the food gap in sub-Saharan Africa by 25%. Okay, so a few takeaways. First, as I said, the problem's actually even bigger than most people think. And one thing about it being bigger is we can't afford to not be smart about how we approach the problem. There are enormous ideologies in the agricultural world on all sides. And I think that tends to obscure a lot of what really matters. And we just took a hard look at just basic data to try to give what really matters. And these are the things that we can do. Above all, agriculture needs to do what it's good at, which is improving its productivity. Phenomenally effective. We just need to do it even more. But we have to do it in a way that simultaneously protects natural landscapes. We have to take pasture, we have to treat pasture productivity as seriously as we treat crop productivity. We have to get out of increasing our wetland areas, particularly peatlands. Mostly, climate-smart agriculture means just being more efficient in our use of inputs. Fertilizer, water, enormous potential to increase fertilizer use efficiency in Asia. We need more fertilizer in Africa. We need to stop overutilizing in Asia and parts of the Western world. And then we have very real opportunities that have enormous collateral health benefits to reduce that level of demand growth. If you did all of these things, we're reasonably confident you could actually achieve the promised land. But it's probably going to take all of them. And so I'll leave you with this last thought. As we define climate-smart agriculture, one of the challenges is that a lot of things are climate-smart agriculture. Increasing productivity, that's what agriculture is. That is a big part of climate-smart agriculture. The challenge of reaching the promised land is to do that even more, and to do it while protecting natural landscapes. It's to become more efficient, even more efficient in our uses of inputs. And it's to treat this excess demand more seriously. So as we decide what the world needs to focus on, how do we put all that together? How do we not just say we're going to support anything that's good in agriculture? Because most of what agriculture is going to do anyway is good. It's going to help move us in the right direction. But we need to make sure it's coupled. We need to couple that productivity growth with land protection. We need to focus on the most important ways of making efficient use of inputs. And I think that's part of the challenge for this alliance. How do we focus on the really, really important things? The potential is there. Agriculture has shown it's capable of doing great things. And now it's the opportunity to try to realize that. Thank you very much.
stop